The October air in coastal Maine did not just chill, it bit with the quiet, structural cold of an ending. Evelyn Vance stood on the wraparound porch of the Queen Anne Victorian, her fingers curled tightly around the chipped white railing. For exactly 40 years, this wood had been her anchor. She had watched the salt air dull its paint, had seen her late husband, Arthur, repaint it 3 separate times, his hands covered in chalky white primer, laughing as he wiped a stray streak from her cheek. Today, the porch felt less like a sanctuary and more like a scaffold. Behind her, the massive oak front door stood slightly ajar, revealing a hallway lined with ghosts of packing tape and hollowed-out spaces. 40 years of marriage do not dissolve gracefully. They are crammed into standard-issue cardboard boxes, taped shut with a screech that echoes too loudly in an empty house. Evelyn, at 62, carried her grief not in tears, but in the stiff, unyielding posture of a woman refusing to break before the tide. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back tightly, her wool coat buttoned to the chin against the rising Atlantic wind. The betrayal had arrived not with a crash, but with the dry rustle of legal bond paper. When Arthur's heart had failed him 6 months ago on the kitchen floor, he had left behind a legacy of warmth, but an estate tangled in a web he never truly understood. It was Julian Vance, Arthur's corporate-driven nephew, who had spun the trap. Julian, with his tailored charcoal suits and teeth too white to be trusted, had stepped into their lives 3 years prior under the guise of family solidarity. He had offered Arthur a reverse mortgage option through his development firm, swearing it was a safety net for their twilight years. Hidden deep within the addendums, couched in dense, predatory legalese, was a clause that triggered immediate foreclosure upon the primary signee's death, bypassing the surviving spouse if certain astronomical, unannounced liquid thresholds weren't met. Julian had called it just standard corporate protocol over a brief, icy phone call. The eviction notice sitting on the kitchen counter, stamped with the cold blue ink of the county sheriff, called it legal. Evelyn called it theft. She walked back inside, her boots clicking softly against the wide plank pine floors. The house smelled of dried lavender, old paper, and the faint, lingering aroma of Arthur's pipe tobacco, a scent that was fading a little more each day. She knelt by the baseboard near the dining room entrance. There, barely visible beneath a layer of fresh wax she had applied over the summer, were 3 small, vertical pencil marks. They were the growth heights of the neighbor's orphan nephew, whom they had taken in for 2 summers. Tactile memories rushed through her fingertips as she touched the wood. Every scratch on these walls had a history. The deep gouge near the pantry was from the time the cast-iron skillet slipped from Arthur's hand during a disastrous attempt at French cooking. The faded patch of wallpaper by the stairs was where their golden retriever, Barnaby, always rested his wet nose while waiting for them to wake up. These were not structural defects. They were the physical manifestation of a life well lived. Yet, to Julian and his team of surveyors who had come by the previous Tuesday to measure the lot with laser levels and clipboards, these walls were merely obstacles to be cleared. They didn't see a home. They saw prime coastal acreage ripe for a luxury condominium complex. Evelyn walked to the bay window looking out over the eastern garden. The perennials were dormant now, their brown stems bowing to the frost. She had planted every single one of them, burying her fingers in the rich Maine soil every spring to cultivate a perimeter of color that bloomed even when the coastal fog rolled in thick and gray. Now, a bright orange plastic surveyor's stake was driven squarely through the center of her prize peony bush. It was a violent, fluorescent intrusion into her sanctuary. She picked up the final small box from the window seat. Inside were only a few items: Arthur's worn leather wallet, a silver-plated pocket watch that no longer ticked, and a framed photograph of the 2 of them taken on this very porch during the blizzard of 1993, bundled in blankets and grinning like children. She closed the flaps and sealed them with a single, deliberate strip of tape. The silence of the house was absolute now, heavy with the weight of what was being left behind. Julian's legal team had given her until noon. The clock on the mantelpiece, which she had already packed, was no longer there to chime the hour, but she could feel the time slipping away through the cold drafts beneath the doors. She had spent her youth here, built her middle age here, and had expected to grow old gracefully within these walls. Instead, she was being excised from her own history, by a piece of paper and a bloodline that valued ledger sheets over legacy. Evelyn picked up the box, tucked it firmly under her arm, and walked toward the door. She did not look back at the empty rooms. To look back was to acknowledge defeat, and as she stepped out into the crisp, unforgiving autumn morning, Evelyn Vance was many things: grieving, homeless, and betrayed, but she was not defeated. The front door clicked shut behind her, but the latch sounded hollow, stripped of its old authority. Evelyn set the cardboard box on the porch deck and took a slow, deliberate breath of the briny air. Before she could walk down the steps, a sudden, instinctual pull drew her back toward the side parlor window. She pressed her palm against the glass, peering into the shadows of the room where she and Arthur had spent thousands of winter evenings. The floorboards inside were pale patches, where the Persian rugs had once shielded them from the sun. Stripped of furniture, the room looked smaller, vulnerable, like an empty shell washed up on the rocky shore. This was the final walkthrough, not through the physical space, which now belonged to a bank ledger, but through the quiet chambers of her own mind. She remembered the phantom sound of Arthur's laughter echoing from the kitchen, the phantom warmth of a fire that had gone out weeks ago. Every square inch of the house was shouting a goodbye she wasn't ready to hear, yet the silence inside remained absolute. Turning away from the glass, she picked up the box and walked down the steps. Barnaby was already waiting by the rusted tailgate of her 2008 Volvo station wagon. The golden retriever's muzzle was frosted with gray, his tail giving a hesitant low thud against the bumper as she approached. He knew the rhythm of the house had changed. He had spent the last 3 days watching the walls go bare, his intelligent eyes tracking every taped box with a quiet, canine anxiety. Evelyn opened the back, sliding the final piece of her past into the crowded cargo bay, alongside a duffel bag of clothes, a few old cast-iron pans, and Barnaby's dog bed. The gravel driveway crunched behind her. It wasn't the sound of her car, but the smooth, expensive purr of a modern engine. A sleek black luxury SUV pulled up to the curb, blocking the driveway entrance, followed closely by a massive white commercial moving truck. The doors of the SUV popped open, and Julian Vance stepped out onto the damp pavement. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke camel hair coat, his polished leather shoes carefully avoiding the mud puddles near the ditch. Behind him, 2 movers in uniform sat in the cab of the truck, idling like vultures waiting for a carcass to clear. Julian offered a practiced, sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes, a salesman's grin tailored for a funeral. He walked toward her, holding a slim leather folder under his arm. He didn't look at the house. He looked at the property line, his eyes scanning the ancient oaks as if already calculating the cost of their removal. "Aunt Evelyn," Julian said, his voice smooth, dripping with a calculated corporate warmth. "I see you're right on schedule. I wanted to come down personally to ensure the transition went smoothly. I know this isn't easy." Evelyn didn't move. She stood beside the fading paint of her station wagon, her hand resting flat on Barnaby's head. The dog let out a low, vibration-like growl, his hackles rising slightly. "You came to watch the locks get changed, Julian. Let's not romanticize a foreclosure." Julian sighed, a theatrical exhale of a busy man burdened by the emotional fragility of others. He opened the leather folder and pulled out a slip of paper. "Look, I know there's bad blood here, but I talked to the board. We want to make sure you're taken care of, at least for the winter. This is a relocation stipend, $5,000. All you have to do is sign the final waiver, releasing the estate from any future probate disputes." He extended the check toward her. The white paper fluttered slightly in the autumn breeze. It was a mockingly small pittance, an insult disguised as charity, designed entirely to buy her silence and legally cement his theft. Evelyn looked at the check, then up at her nephew's face. She saw the hollow ambition in his eyes, the absolute lack of reverence for the 40 years of love and labor built into the soil beneath his feet. Slowly, she pushed his hand away. "Keep your money, Julian," Evelyn said, her voice steady, cutting through the wind with a terrifying clarity. "You've taken my home, but you don't get to buy your conscience clean for $5,000. You'll need every cent of that corporate treasury when the foundation of what you build here starts to slide into the sea." Julian's smile vanished, his jaw tightening as he pocketed the check. "Have it your way, Evelyn." "Pride doesn't pay rent. Neither does a stolen name," she replied softly. She climbed into the driver's seat of the station wagon, her movements fluid and unbroken by the weight of her grief. Barnaby rested his heavy chin on the console between the seats, his brown eyes fixed on the road ahead. Evelyn turned the key, the old engine turning over with a familiar, mechanical rumble. She shifted into drive, pulled past the moving truck without looking back, and left the only life she had ever known in the rearview mirror, carrying nothing but her dignity into the gray October fog. The neon sign outside the Pinecrest Motel hummed with a persistent, buzzing rattle that vibrated straight through the thin glass of room 1114. For 3 weeks, that buzz had been the soundtrack to Evelyn's new reality. The room smelled of industrial disinfectant and stale winter air, a stark and sterile contrast to the lavender-scented halls she had inhabited for 40 years. Every morning began the same way. Barnaby would lift his heavy head from the linoleum floor, nudging her knee with his cold nose, a silent reminder that life, however fractured, demanded to move forward. Evelyn would sit at the small laminate table, a cup of lukewarm gas station coffee cooling by her elbow, and open the local county gazette. She wasn't looking for a way backward. The past was a locked room, and Julian held the key. She was looking for a place to survive. Her fingers, stained slightly with the black ink of the public notices section, traced down the columns of the county sheriff's estate auctions. Most listings were commercial foreclosures or small suburban plots, way beyond her dwindling savings. Then, on a Tuesday morning, her eyes caught a small, poorly formatted block of text buried at the very bottom of the page. It was a listing for the Blackwood property, located on the northernmost marshy edge of the township. The description was brutal in its honesty. An abandoned colonial-style residence built in the early 20th century, officially condemned by the Municipal Housing Authority, and scheduled for mechanical demolition by the city within 60 days if the outstanding back taxes and safety liens weren't cleared by a new owner. To anyone else, it was a legal death sentence wrapped in rotting timber. To Evelyn, who knew the local lore of the county, the Blackwood name carried a faint, tragic echo. It had once been the seat of a prominent coastal family before they vanished into bankruptcy and obscurity following the Great Depression. The house had sat abandoned for decades, swallowed by saltgrass and ignored by developers who deemed the marshy ground too unstable for modern construction. It was a ruin, a ghost of an era that the town had spent half a century trying to forget. Yet, as she stared at the blurred photograph in the newspaper, she felt a strange, inexplicable pull. It was a structural reflection of her own life, condemned by the world, standing alone against the elements, stubbornly refusing to collapse. The auction was held the following Thursday in the drafty basement of the county courthouse. The room was sparse, filled mostly with local contractors in flannel shirts and real estate scouts, looking for cheap timber rights or salvageable architectural ironwork. Evelyn sat in the back row, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her wool coat, Barnaby staying quietly in the station wagon outside. The auctioneer, a stout man with a booming voice and a headset microphone that crackled with static, rattled through the day's inventory with corporate efficiency. Tractors, seized vehicles, and parcel lots were flipped in minutes. When the Blackwood property finally flashed onto the overhead projector, an audible murmur of dismissal rippled through the crowd. The image showed a sprawling, dark-timbered skeleton of a house, its roof sagging like a tired spine, windows boarded up with weathered plywood, and wild ivy choking the porch pillars. Moving on to Parcel 402, the Blackwood estate, the auctioneer droned, shuffling his papers with a dry slap. We have a minimum structural warning on this one, folks. City assessment declares the foundation unstable, interior structural rot, and a mandatory demolition clause attached to the deed. The buyer assumes all liability for cleanup and leveling within 2 months. Do I have an opening bid of $5,000? Silence fell over the basement. The contractors looked at their boots. The scouts shut their notebooks. Nobody wanted to buy a lawsuit wrapped in splintered oak. 3,000? The auctioneer tried again, his tone dropping an octave into boredom. Do I hear 1,500? Look, fellas, the city just wants this off the municipal ledger before the snow hits. Give me 1,000 to cover the filing fees. Still, no one moved. The room was dead. The auctioneer sighed, running a hand over his bald head, clearly frustrated by the bureaucratic paperwork a no-bid status would require. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the empty rows, before resting on Evelyn sitting silently in the back. A cynical, tired smirk touched his lips. "Tell you what," the auctioneer said, leaning against his podium and speaking directly into the microphone with a dry, theatrical chuckle. "Let's clear the red tape. Do I hear a single dollar just to get the paperwork moving and save the county a trip to the dumpster?" The crowd chuckled softly, a low murmur of amusement at the joke. Nobody raised a hand. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken, a sudden, electric clarity wash over her. She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing past the keys to her station wagon until they wrapped around a single, crumpled $1 bill, the physical remainder of her immediate cash after paying the motel bill. She pulled her hand out and raised it firmly into the drafty air of the basement. $1, Evelyn said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the residual laughter of the room like a blade. The auctioneer froze, his gavel hovering mid-air. He blinked, looking at her as if ensuring she wasn't a hallucination. The room turned around, dozens of eyes locking onto the solitary, silver-haired woman in the back row. The auctioneer cleared his throat, the humor vanishing from his face as he realized she was entirely serious. Legal protocol was legal protocol. $1 from the lady in the back, he stated, his voice dropping the theatrical rhythm. Going once for $1. Going twice. He slammed the wooden gavel down with a sharp, decisive crack that echoed off the concrete walls. Sold to the bidder in the back for $1. Step forward to sign the deed, ma'am, and Godspeed with the wrecking ball. Evelyn stood up, her knees stiff but steady. She walked down the center aisle, ignoring the whispers of the men around her, and laid the crumpled bill onto the clerk's desk. With a single stroke of a pen, she became the legal custodian of a forgotten empire, owning nothing but a ruin and the 60 days she had left to live within it. The gravel road dissolved into a narrow, mud-slicked track where the salt marsh began to reclaim the gravel, forcing the old Volvo to crawl through the encroaching gray fog. When the trees finally parted, the Blackwood house rose from the tall grass like an ancient, capsized ship stranded on the shore. Up close, it was less a home and more a Gothic skeleton, its dark timbers stained almost black by decades of Atlantic gales. Wild English ivy, thick as a man's wrist, clawed its way up the crumbling brick chimneys, while heavy plywood boards hung crookedly over the windows like blindfolds. The local paper had called it an eyesore, a municipal hazard that should have been bulldozed when Truman was in office. But as Evelyn stepped out of the car, the biting wind whipping her coat against her shins, she did not see a hazard. She saw a mirror. The house was fractured, abandoned by its bloodline, and marked for destruction by men who only valued the ground it sat upon. Yet, despite the rot and the heavy dampness that clung to its frame, the structure still stood, holding its ground against the horizon. Barnaby stepped out of the tailgate, his nose instantly lifting to catch the scent of decades-old dust, salt water, and wild rot. He didn't bark. He merely stayed close to Evelyn's hip as she approached the heavy front porch. The steps groaned under her weight, a soft, spongy protest that warned her to tread lightly. The heavy brass doorknob was green with patina, frozen shut by time and salt air. Evelyn had to throw her shoulder against the solid oak door, pushing until the ancient lock gave way with a violent, splintering crack that echoed through the hollow interior. The air that rushed out to greet her was cold, heavy, and thick with the scent of the late 1940s, a mixture of wool rugs, coal dust, and the sweet, decaying smell of dry rot. Stepping across the threshold, her boots left deep, pristine prints in a layer of dust that had settled over the grand entryway like gray snow. High above, a crystal chandelier hung shrouded in thick webs, catching the pale, filtered light that managed to squeeze through the cracks in the boarded windows. The town had forgotten this place completely, leaving it trapped in a permanent amber of neglect. The first few nights were an unmitigated battle against the elements. The city had disconnected the power grid decades ago, and the autumn nights in Maine arrived early and freezing, dropping the temperature inside the house until Evelyn's breath formed pale plumes in the dark. She had no furnace, no running water, and only the supplies she had brought in the back of her station wagon. She set up a temporary camp in the small parlor just off the grand foyer. the only room where the ceiling didn't actively weep when the dark clouds broke over the coast. By the flickering golden glow of 3 thick emergency candles, Evelyn began the grueling process of reclaiming the space. The work was visceral, demanding every ounce of her remaining physical strength. She worked well past midnight, her hands clad in heavy work gloves, as she tore down decades of thick, cobweb draperies that dissolved into gray powder at her touch. The sound of her old straw broom sweeping across the wide oak floorboards became a steady, rhythmic mantra, a declaration that she was still alive, that this house was still occupied. When a fierce northeaster rattled the coast on her 3rd night, the house groaned like a dying beast. Rain began to violently pelt the roof, quickly finding the structural weaknesses in the old shingles. Water started dripping steadily from the ceiling of her makeshift bedroom, splashing loudly into an old plastic bucket she had scavenged from the trunk of her car. Evelyn didn't panic. She climbed an old, creaking stepladder she found in the pantry, her flashlight held tightly between her teeth, and used a roll of heavy plastic sheeting and duct tape to patch the leaking plaster, working until her arms ached with exhaustion. Her fingers grew numb from the draft whistling through the floorboards, and her back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache she hadn't felt since her youth. Yet, with every bucket of debris she hauled to the porch, with every window frame she scraped clean of dead ivy, a strange, fierce sense of peace began to settle over her. She was no longer the grieving widow hiding in a sterile motel room, waiting for the legal axe to fall. She was a woman building a fortress out of a ruin. She washed the grime from a small pane of glass in the kitchen, watching the pale morning sun cut through the clean circle she had made. The work was stripped of luxury, reduced to the bare mechanics of survival, but it was entirely hers. Every clean square foot of flooring was a quiet victory against Julian, against the bank, and against the town that had written her off. She was reclaiming her independence one swept floor at a time, anchoring her soul into the deep, resilient timbers of the Blackwood house, completely unaware that the house was waiting to give something back. By the 2nd week of November, the line between Evelyn and the Blackwood house had begun to blur. Her palms were calloused. Her face was smudged with soot from the working fireplace she had spent 3 days clearing, and her breath no longer felt out of place in the cold rooms. She had migrated her efforts to what had once been the master library, a cavernous, shadow-drenched room lined with empty floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that still held the faint, sweet scent of rotting leather bindings. The floor here was the worst in the house, buckling upward in violent, water-damaged ridges where an old roof leak had poured rain down the interior walls for a decade. The oak planks were warped and soft as cork in some places, dangerously giving way underfoot. Equipped with a rusted iron crowbar she had found in the cellar, Evelyn worked systematically, kneeling on a piece of foam padding as she tore up the ruined wood. Barnaby lay a few feet away near the hearth, his ears twitching at the sharp, rhythmic screech of old hand-forged nails being ripped from their joists. It was physically punishing work. Every levered plank required the full weight of her body, her shoulders straining against the stubborn, century-old carpentry. Midway through the afternoon, as the pale autumn sun began its rapid descent toward the marsh line, Evelyn jammed the tip of the crowbar beneath a particularly thick, darkened plank near the center of the room. She threw her weight onto the iron bar. The wood didn't split with the usual wet, splintering groan of rotten oak. Instead, the tool slipped, diving deeper into the dark gap between the secondary floor joists and striking something solid with a sharp, metallic clank. The sound was distinct, heavy, and undeniably hollow. Evelyn froze. She rested her hands on the crowbar, her breath shallow in the quiet room. Barnaby lifted his head, his tail giving a single, curious thump against the floor. Slowly, carefully, she repositioned the crowbar and pried the surrounding planks upward, tossing the splintered wood aside until a gaping 3-foot hole lay open before her. She shone her flashlight down into the darkness of the subfloor. Resting securely in the hand-carved recess between 2 massive hemlock support beams was a large, rectangular mass. It wasn't part of the house's framing. It had been deliberately hidden, tucked away beneath the secondary joists where no casual inspector or demolition crew would ever think to look. Evelyn dropped to her knees, reaching her arms deep into the dust-choked cavity. Her fingers brushed against a coarse, stiff fabric. Gritting her teeth against the strain in her lower back, she gripped the edges of the mass and hoisted it upward out of the floor. It was incredibly heavy, nearly slipping from her hands before she managed to slide it onto the solid section of the library floorboards. The object was completely wrapped in thick, dark green oilskin cloth, a heavy, waterproof material used by mariners to protect cargo from the corrosive salt air of the Atlantic. The fabric was stiff with age and coated in a fine layer of gray silt, but it had done its job perfectly. Evelyn unbuckled the rotting leather straps holding the cloth together and peeled back the stiff layers. Beneath the oilskin lay a heavy, military-grade iron lockbox. It was a formidable piece of early 20th century security, reinforced with thick steel bands and secured by a massive dual-key tumbler lock that looked entirely impenetrable. The iron was cast in a dull, industrial black, largely free of rust, thanks to the protective wrapping. But it was the center of the lid that made Evelyn's heart skip a beat. Embossed into the thick metal plate was a striking raised crest, a stylized anchor entwined with a soaring osprey, flanked by the bold stamped letters BSC. Beneath the insignia, a date was cleanly engraved into the iron, 1924. Evelyn smoothed her hand over the cold metal, wiping away the remaining dust to reveal the full title stamped below the crest. Blackwood Shipping Company, Port of Portland. This wasn't just a personal strongbox, it was a corporate vault from the golden age of the Blackwood Empire, buried beneath the floorboards of the family matriarch's sanctuary just before the world fell apart in the Great Depression. The weight of the box spoke of secrets intentionally buried, preserved in the dark like a time capsule waiting for a hand that cared enough to dig it up. Evelyn stared at the locked iron chest, the crowbar still resting at her side, realizing that the $1 ruin she had bought to die in was suddenly breathing with the ghosts of a forgotten world. The dual-key tumbler lock resisted at first, a stubborn century of frozen iron refusing to yield. Evelyn did not have the keys, but she had the crowbar, a heavy ball-peen hammer, and the quiet, untamed desperation of a woman with nothing left to lose. She worked with a slow, mechanical precision, driving the wedge of the crowbar into the seam of the lid and striking the end with the hammer. The sound of metal hitting metal cracked through the empty library like pistol shots. On the fourth strike, the internal pins sheared with a loud metallic snap, and the heavy iron lid swung open on its rusted hinges. There was no glitter of gold inside, no clinking of silver coins to validate the town's rumors of buried wealth. Instead, the box was packed tight with the scent of old cedar, preserved vellum, and linseed oil. Evelyn reached inside, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted the first layer of defense, a velvet-lined tray containing 6 thick, leather-bound volumes. She opened the top journal. The cream-colored pages were crisp, untouched by the dampness of the marsh, thanks to the oilskin seal. Written in a sharp, elegant, fountain pen cursive were the personal chronicles of Clara Blackwood. As Evelyn turned the pages, a forgotten history unfolded. Clara had been a visionary, a pioneering female architect who graduated from a prestigious European institution in the early 1900s, only to find an American professional landscape entirely closed to women. To see her visions realized, she had operated through her male business partners, signing her revolutionary designs over to men who took the credit, the fame, and the fortunes. Clara was the true mind behind the town's iconic granite courthouse, the historic library, and the sweeping coastal promenades. The journals detailed the systematic erasure of her name from the public record, a deliberate corporate silencing by men who couldn't stomach the genius of a woman. Beneath the journals lay a thick cylinder of heavy waxed linen tubes. Evelyn pulled them out, unrolling the stiff material across the dusty floorboards, weighting the edges down with pieces of broken oak planks. They were original architectural blueprints, rendered in a brilliant, unfaded Prussian blue. Her breath caught in her throat. These weren't just structural designs, they were original, foundational land surveys from 1926. Pressed into the bottom corner of each linen sheet was a raised, gold-leaf notary seal, authenticated by the state Supreme Court before the Great Depression. The documents outlined a staggering truth. The Blackwood Shipping Company hadn't just owned the marshland, They held the perpetual, untransferable riparian water rights and original land deeds to the entire northern coastal commercial district. Evelyn's eyes tracked the property coordinates, her heart hammering against her ribs. The legal boundaries encompassed the entire commercial waterfront, including the exact acreage where Julian Vance's development firm had recently broken ground on their multi-million-dollar luxury condominium empire. The city had never legally acquired this land. They had simply assumed it was abandoned, shifting it onto the municipal ledger through a series of clerical oversights after the Blackwood family vanished. The true deed had been sleeping in the dark, waiting under the floorboards. Resting at the very bottom of the iron vault was the final treasure, a flat wooden crate packed with specialized cotton batting. Evelyn lifted the lid to reveal a collection of small, unframed canvases. They were original American Impressionist paintings, executed with thick, confident brushstrokes of seafoam greens, deep ultramarines, and the brilliant amber of Maine autumns. Each piece was signed in the corner, C. Blackwood. They captured the raw, untamed beauty of the town's early maritime days, painted with a mastery that could rival the masters of the era. A handwritten note pinned to the velvet lining explained their isolation. Clara had hidden the collection away to protect her life's artistic work from a predatory family lawsuit brought by estranged relatives who sought to liquidate her estate during the financial collapse of 1929. Evelyn sat back on her heels, surrounded by the blue light of the blueprints and the vibrant colors of the hidden paintings. The dust motes danced in the fading sunbeam cutting through the library window, illuminating a legacy that had been buried alive. Julian had stripped her of her home with a weapon made of ink and paper, believing her to be powerless, a disposable casualty of progress. She looked down at the gold leaf seals of the original deeds resting beneath her hands. The universe, it seemed, had a wicked sense of irony. She had traded her very last dollar for a condemned house, and in return, the house had handed her the legal execution order for her nephew's empire. The office of Thomas Sterling smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee that had been brewing since dawn. Located in a modest, saltbox house near the town harbor, it was a far cry from the glass and steel high-rises where Julian Vance's lawyers operated. Thomas, a 70-year-old retired attorney, with a shock of white hair and sharp avian eyes, had spent his youth defending local fishermen against corporate zoning laws. When Evelyn spread the Prussian blue linens of the Blackwood blueprints across his oversized pine desk, Thomas did not speak for a full 5 minutes. He leaned over the maps, his magnifying glass hovering inches above the gold leaf notary seals, his breathing rhythmic and heavy in the quiet room. "Good God, Evelyn," Thomas whispered, his finger tracing the boundary lines that extended past the marshlands and deep into the heart of the modern waterfront. "I grew up hearing rumors about Clara Blackwood. My grandfather used to say she was the smartest architect on the eastern seaboard, but the history books treated her like she never existed. This isn't just a journal. This is a confession of a town's theft." For 3 days, the two of them lived on takeout and adrenaline, turning Thomas's office into a war room. They cross-referenced the 1926 Blackwood land surveys with the county's municipal tax registries and property transfers spanning the last 80 years. What they found was a massive, systemic bureaucratic failure. During the chaotic financial scramble of the 1929 stock market crash, the city had mistakenly categorized the Blackwood commercial district as tax-delinquent public domain after the family's sudden departure. But because the original deeds were held under a perpetual, untransferable maritime trust, clearly outlined in Clara's legal addendums, the city had never actually acquired the title. They had been leasing, selling, and zoning stolen land for nearly a century. "The blueprints and the deeds aren't just historical artifacts, Evelyn," Thomas said, slamming a heavy law tome onto the desk with a thump that made Barnaby jump from his spot by the stove. "They are actively, aggressively, legally binding. The chain of custody was never broken. It was just buried. And because the city never owned the land, every single contract they signed with private developers is completely null and void." The leverage was staggering. Julian Vance's flagship project, the multi-million-dollar Vance Harborside luxury residences, was currently breaking ground squarely on the coordinates protected by Clara Blackwood's 1926 riparian rights. Julian's firm had already poured millions into the foundations, backed by foreign investors and massive municipal bonds. If these documents were filed with the state Supreme Court, An immediate injunction would freeze construction, exposing Julian's firm to catastrophic breach of contract lawsuits that would bankrupt his corporate empire within a month. He hadn't just built on a weak foundation, he had built his entire future on property he had no legal right to touch. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, watching the morning fog roll past Thomas's window. For weeks, she had carried the weight of her eviction like a brand, believing she was a leaf caught in the indifferent machinery of corporate progress. Now the tables had turned with a violent mathematical precision. Julian had used a microscopic clause in a reverse mortgage to steal her past. She was about to use a century-old anchor and osprey seal to dismantle his future. "We aren't going to court just yet, Thomas," Evelyn said softly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the 1926 deed. "Julian likes to talk about standard corporate protocol. I think it's time we offer him a private demonstration." The mid-November wind howled through the gaps in the Blackwood library window, but the fireplace roared with a fierce, crackling heat that Evelyn had spent the morning nursing. A single oak table, salvaged from the kitchen, sat in the center of the room, lit by the pale afternoon light and 2 iron candlesticks. When the crunch of expensive tires broke the silence outside, Barnaby did not growl. He simply stood beside Evelyn, alert and steady. Julian Vance entered the house like a man inspecting a tomb he had already marked for the furnace. He didn't take off his coat, nor did he wipe the marsh mud from his designer leather loafers. He strode into the library, his phone already in his hand, a look of profound boredom and irritation written across his sharp features. "You have 10 minutes, Evelyn," Julian said, his voice echoing off the bare lath walls. He didn't look at Thomas Sterling, who sat quietly in the shadows behind the table. "My secretary said you wanted to discuss the relocation stipend. I told you before, the $5,000 was a courtesy. The offer expired 2 weeks ago, but since you've finally seen reason and stopped hiding out in this garbage fire of a house, I might be able to get the board to approve 3. He pulled out a silver pen, expecting her to produce a waiver. He stood there, arrogant and impatient, a modern conqueror waiting for a broken woman to sign away her dignity for a handful of silver. Evelyn did not flinch. She sat perfectly still, her silver hair catching the firelight, her posture radiating a calm that made Julian's eyes narrow slightly. "Sit down, Julian," she said softly. "I don't have time for a family reunion, Evelyn. If you're not signing—" "Julian," Thomas Sterling interrupted, stepping into the light and sliding a thick, leather-bound folder across the oak table. "I suggest you look at the addendums before you finish that sentence. It concerns the foundational topography of your harborside development." Julian let out a cynical scoff, but the gravity in the old lawyer's voice made him hesitate. He picked up the folder with one hand, flipping it open with an aggressive snap of his wrist. His eyes scanned the first page, a certified copy of the 1926 Blackwood Shipping Company deed, bearing the active, gold-leaf seal of the state Supreme Court. The arrogance drained from Julian's face in a slow, terrifying retreat. His breath hitched. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his fingers suddenly trembling against the paper as he recognized the coordinates. The survey lines completely swallowed his multi-million-dollar luxury condominium complex, cutting off his access to the waterfront and invalidating the municipal leases his firm had spent 3 years securing. "This is a joke," Julian stammered, his corporate veneer cracking to reveal a desperate, panicked child underneath. "This house was abandoned 80 years ago. The city took possession. This isn't legally binding. My legal team—" "Your legal team missed a perpetual maritime trust, Julian," Thomas said, his voice dropping like an anvil. "The city never legally acquired this title. They sold you stolen property. If we file these authenticated documents with the state registrar tomorrow morning, an automatic injunction will halt your construction by noon. Your investors will pull out by Friday, and your firm will be facing federal breach of contract lawsuits before the month is out. You aren't just broke, son, you're ruined." Julian collapsed into the wooden chair opposite Evelyn, the paper fluttering from his hand onto the table. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. The power dynamic had completely shifted. The corporate predator was suddenly caught in a century-old trap, staring at the woman he had discarded as if she were a ghost holding a blade. "What do you want?" Julian whispered, his voice hoarse, his eyes darting toward the door, as if looking for an escape that didn't exist. "How much? $1 million? 2? Name your price, Evelyn. We can settle this out of court. Evelyn leaned forward, looking into the eyes of the boy who had stolen her past. She saw no malice left in him, only the pathetic, hollow terror of a man who realized his empire was built on sand. "I don't want your money, Julian," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the chill of the room with a beautiful, devastating clarity. "I don't want revenge, because revenge is a fire that burns the house it's built in. I want justice. I want security, and I want a name restored." The ink on the settlement papers dried in the quiet warmth of Thomas Sterling's office, but the shockwaves rippled through the county's corporate offices for weeks. Faced with absolute ruin, Julian's firm surrendered without firing a single legal shot. The terms Evelyn dictated were non-negotiable and absolute. To avoid total bankruptcy and a cascade of federal lawsuits from frozen investors, the development firm was forced to forfeit the deed to Evelyn's original Victorian home, wiping the predatory reverse mortgage from the county ledgers as if it had never existed. Furthermore, Julian's company was mandated to pay massive historical back taxes to the town for the commercial district and completely fund the structural and historical restoration of the Blackwood estate under the supervision of the State Historical Society. The day the keys to her old Queen Anne home were returned to her, Evelyn stood on its familiar wraparound porch. The moving trucks were gone, and the house stood empty, waiting for her to step back into the 40 years of comfort she had lost. But as she unlocked the front door and looked inside, she felt no rush of warmth. The rooms were beautiful, but they felt like a coat she had outgrown. The grief that had anchored her to these walls had shifted, replaced by something fiercer and more independent. Her old life with Arthur was a masterpiece, but it was a completed chapter, not the whole book. To move back in would be to retreat into the safety of a ghost story. 2 days later, Evelyn signed a long-term lease agreement with a young, struggling couple from town, a mechanic and an assistant teacher with a toddler who had been priced out of the coastal rental market by Julian's aggressive developments. She set the rent at a fraction of the market rate, just enough to cover the property insurance. Watching the young mother cry tears of relief as she held the keys, Evelyn felt a profound, rooting peace. She wasn't just saving herself, she was using the architecture of her past to shelter the future of others. She walked down the steps of the Victorian for the last time, whistled for Barnaby, and turned her station wagon back toward the salt marsh, ready to build something entirely her own. 2 years later, the autumn air in coastal Maine carried the same sharp, briny kick, but the landscape had fundamentally transformed. The Blackwood house no longer resembled a capsized ship rotting in the salt marsh. Fully restored to its original 20th century grandeur, the dark-timbered colonial stood proud against the Atlantic horizon, its cedar shingles oiled to a rich, warm amber, and its tall windows gleaming with clear, unbroken glass. A tasteful, hand-carved wooden sign near the gravel driveway now greeted visitors in elegant gold lettering, "The Clara Blackwood Cultural Center and Museum," funded entirely by the restitution corporate bonds extracted from Julian's firm. The estate had become a breathtaking sanctuary dedicated to the forgotten women of American history. Inside, the once ruined library was now alive with the soft murmur of visitors and the warm, golden glow of track lighting. Evelyn had personally curated the exhibition spaces. Along the walls, Clara Blackwood's original Prussian blue blueprints were preserved behind museum-grade glass, their gold notary seals catching the light like stars. Nearby, the stunning collection of Clara's American Impressionist paintings finally breathed the open air, their vibrant blues and seafoam greens drawing art historians from all over New England. Clara's handwritten journals lay open in climate-controlled cases, her elegant cursive finally telling the true story of the mind that had shaped the town's very foundations. Evelyn had transformed a personal victory into a public monument for every brilliant woman whose legacy had been systematically swept beneath the floorboards of history. As the late afternoon crowd began to dwindle, Evelyn walked through the grand foyer, her steps confident on the beautifully restored oak floors. At 64, her silver hair was still pulled back tightly, but the weary tension that had once locked her shoulders was entirely gone. Barnaby, his muzzle completely white now, trotted contentedly by her side, his tail giving a rhythmic thump as he greeted the last departing guests. Evelyn retreated to her private office just off the main exhibition hall. On her cherrywood desk sat a small, modest object that stood in stark contrast to the historic grandeur of the museum. A single, wrinkled $1 bill, flattened and preserved inside a heavy, gold-leaf frame. It was her North Star. It was a tangible piece of paper that reminded her of the exact moment she had looked at a condemned ruin and decided it was still worth saving. She stepped out onto her new private porch, holding a warm mug of tea as the sun began its slow, dramatic descent behind the marsh line. Before her stretched a massive, sprawling garden that she had cultivated with her own hands over the last 24 months. The perennial peony bushes, once crushed by fluorescent corporate surveyor stakes, were now thriving, their deep root systems anchored firmly into the rich, dark Maine soil. The sky bled into brilliant hues of crimson, violet, and gold, reflecting perfectly off the calm tidal waters of the bay. Evelyn leaned against the sturdy white railing, taking a deep, restorative breath of the evening air. She had lost a house, but she had discovered a kingdom. Looking out over the legacy she had fought for, she knew with absolute clarity that the world would always try to measure worth in ledgers and luxury, but sometimes the things that society discards hold the greatest, most unbreakable value of all.